the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford University. Reinvigorating gender equality in the 21st century.
I'd like to welcome you to this talk, and in particular, welcome Professor Kristen Schilt, author of Just One of the Guys, Transgender Men and the Persistence of Gender Inequality. And I think it's successful on at least two main fronts. One, it highlights the experiences of a previously understudied group, that is transgender men, and I think this is an important focus in its own right. But it does even more than this, and that is by interviewing transgender men, both before and after they transition, we get to see how gender more generally affects workplace experiences.
So in 2005, then Harvard President Larry Summers gave a now infamous talk where he talked about how to diversify the fields of science and engineering. Reflecting on the low participation of women in these occupations, Summers manages in one speech to give an overview of all the main explanatory factors that are used to account for the persistence of workplace gender inequality. A great deal of public discussion followed from Summers' talk, both from supporters and critics. But one response that garnered a great deal of attention came from right here at Stanford University from Professor Ben Barres. In a 2006 article in the science journal Nature, Barres offered his own experiences in the sciences as a counterpoint to Summers' speculations. So as Barbara, Barres was one of the few women in her science classes and recounted having her abilities continually questioned by both peers and by professors. As Ben, however, things started to change. In recounting one story that made him deeply aware of this change, he said, "Shortly after I changed sex, a faculty member was heard to say, 'Ben Barres gave a great seminar today, but then his work is much better than his sister's.'" I like to start off with this particular case of talking about Summers and Barres because it illuminates these often conflicting perspectives on workplace gender inequality. So Summers' speech resonates with what I call natural difference schemas, which attribute divergent and often unequal outcomes to men and women to innate differences in cognitive and physical abilities, reproductive roles, and emotional landscapes. And it's these kinds of natural difference schemas, which we can think of as cognitive maps that we use to make sense of the world, that make books like Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus such huge sellers. Barres, in contrast, his experiences resonate more with a social constructionist approach that acknowledges that there's biological differences between men and women, but argues that these differences are exaggerated and naturalized in a way that makes structural constraints on people's lives invisible. So what I was interested in doing in my research was looking at new ways to bring empirical data to bear on this debate. So in my book, Just One of the Guys, I focus on the experiences of transgender men or trans men, such as Ben Barres, who've had the experience of working both as women and later as men. Now I'm going to argue in this talk that this experience provides trans men with what Patricia Hill Collins has called an outsider within perspective on power and inequality. So in other words, having been hired as women and then transitioning to work as men allows them to articulate gendered workplace disparities in unique ways. For me, trans men offered an intervention into these theoretical and common sense explanations about workplace gender inequality. They undergo, as Shelley noted, a radical change in their social identity. However, they have the same human capital, the same skills and abilities, and the same childhood gender socialization. So as I'm going to show in this talk, the changes that result in their workplace experiences are a window into how gender difference is socially constituted. And these experiences also provide insight into how ideas about difference can translate into inequality. So what I wanted to know was what happens in a specific workplace when someone is hired as a woman and then transitions to become a man. We conceive of gender as hierarchical, with femaleness and femininity at the bottom and maleness and masculinity at the top. Trans men were attempting to sort of move up the gender hierarchy, which was a change in status and social capital that I was particularly interested in. And I've never encountered a trans man who said that they transitioned to get male privilege, but that's often a common assumption that people have when they're trying to make sense of it. That particularly men could say, well, of course a woman would want to be a man. Like, why wouldn't you? That there's kind of a cultural justification. And so I wanted to know how this was going to play out in the workplace when people were making sense of this kind of transition. So I did do an interview study, and I decided to compare two different kinds of workplace strategies. So I compared people who publicly transitioned and remained in the same jobs, and I call this an open strategy, and people who got new jobs that are known just as men. So none of their coworkers knew that they had once previously worked as women. And I just want to be clear that these are strategies, not identities. So the same person could have the experience of openly transitioning and then going stealth, or vice versa. They could come out as transgender later on. So most of the people I interviewed actually had experience with both kinds of workplace strategies. And what I started off looking at was how do workplaces and employers and coworkers respond to stealth trans men and open trans men. Stealth trans men also felt that at times they had to really change their behavior in order to fit in at the workplace as a man. And a lot of this had to do with figuring out what the appropriate boundaries were between men and women. And so they would say things like, as a woman, I would have conversations about sex with other women, and that didn't seem problematic. But when people perceive you as a man, it's suddenly creepy, and that could be considered sexual harassment. And they would say, I had never even been in a situation where someone accused me of sexual harassment, and I had to learn really quickly that it's not okay to have these kinds of conversations with women. Other issues of change were about language. So Winston, who had been a radical lesbian and went stealth at work as a man, so they had to quickly think about using expressions like dyke. And so he was saying that they had some programs at his work for LGBT employees, and they were trying to recruit new employees, and he casually mentioned to someone, that new woman we hired, she kind of looks like a dyke, like we should ask her if she wants to be part of it. And his coworker said, that is totally homophobic, and it's really inappropriate, and you can't make that kind of comment about someone. And he said, it's just killed me to be a radical, former radical lesbian, and now everyone thinks I'm homophobic. And he said, I had to realize that people perceive me as like a straight white man, and I can't use that kind of language anymore at work. And so that could be kind of a sharp learning curve. But why do these changes matter, right? So we see people sort of creating these differences between men and women, but why do they matter? And this is really where it ties into this point about inequality. So the second question that I was interested in looking at was, are trans men able to access the workplace benefits associated with being men? And by this I mean, men are documented to have more authority than women, more room for advancement, can also have sort of higher salaries. And what I found in the interviews was that 2/3 of trans men in both states reported increases in what I would describe as authority and competence, reward for their work, and economic gains and opportunity. So in terms of authority and competence, when I asked Henry what the biggest change he noticed between working as a woman and working as a man was, he said, do you know how smart I am? Suddenly I'm the smartest person ever. And he said, when I was working as a woman, no matter how much fact I had or how much evidence I had to back up statements, people were constantly asking me, well, are you sure about that? And he's like, now I just say anything off the top of my head and people take it on faith. He's like, it's so strange to not have to defend your positions. Describing an experience that was deeply unsettling for him, Trevor said, in a professional workshop or conference setting, a woman would make a comment or an observation, and she'd be overlooked. And I would raise my hand, and I would try to reinforce her and make a similar point, and all of a sudden it would be directed at me, that's an excellent point. I saw this happen in undergrad, so it's not like it was a surprise, but it was disconcerting to have happen to me. And again, this really exemplifies this outsider within experience, that trans men who did think that they saw these positive changes were often deeply aware of the fact that these changes came at the expense of women, and they could be very unsettling to them. And a lot of stealth trans men said they saw this kind of pattern, that they felt they were offered promotions that more senior women were better suited for, but that they were seen as a more obvious choice. But they also added that as a man, they felt like, if they said to somebody, I don't really want this job, but this woman over here would be great, that men listened to them more and were like, oh, I hadn't even thought about her. And so they actually felt in some cases they were able to get more women promoted because men took their advice more because they saw them as men. And then race and ethnicity played a major role. So my data suggests that the experience of trans men of color is radically different from their white counterparts. Christopher felt that he was treated differently than men at work, not just because he was shorter than most of the men, but because he was the only Asian man in his workplace. And he said, all the guys here just view me as passive, I'm not seen as very serious, they don't take me very seriously. Keith articulated the differences in his workplace experience as, I went from being an obnoxious black woman to a scary black man. He worked in a blue-collar job where they did a lot of training exercises, and he was one of the only black men there, and was continually asked to play the suspect in these training exercises, which he said nobody ever thinks that this is problematic. He noted that he had to be extremely careful at work now when he got angry, that as a woman he could kind of yell and he could pound his fist, but as a black man, that people were immediately like, whoa, that's out of control. Like, you need to really be careful about your behavior. Aaron, who worked in a nonprofit and was the only African American in his nonprofit, got written up in a staff meeting for rolling his eyes in what was described as an aggressive and threatening manner to one of his colleagues, and said, this is what I think, I think this has to do with being the only black man here, that I'm perceived as being threatening in this way that other people are not. So I bring up these experiences just to, again, make this point that when we're talking about gender inequality and we're talking about advantage and privilege, that intersectionality really matters, that taking in how different identities shape relationships to advantage and privilege is extremely important. So I'm going to end by talking a little bit about why open trans men, what made some transitions more successful than others. So I think that's an interesting question that people have. So why did some people experience discrimination and other people didn't, or did not feel that they were experiencing discrimination? And a lot of this had to do with how managers and human resources people acted when they were approached about an open workplace transition. So when trans men worked for a boss or an HR person who said, okay, well, I've never dealt with this before, but I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to figure out the protocol, we're going to work out a plan together, and I'm going to set the tone for everybody in the workplace. That's when things tended to go well. And it wasn't that all coworkers in the workplace were happy about their colleague transitioning. And in fact, most people could say, I can think of at least one or two people who's really not happy about this. So Gordon gave the example of, he's like, every time I go to the bathroom, if I happen to be, if this other guy at work is going at the same time and he sees me walking towards the bathroom, he just turns around and he walks back to his desk and sits down. He does not want to go in the bathroom with me. But for him, he was like, but you know what? He's the one and sits down. I still get to use the bathroom, and that's fine. And that tended to be what this kind of managerial support did, was that people who were not very happy about the transition felt that they were being under surveillance, that they were less likely to act out. Versus when a manager said, you can do that here, but I can't control anyone in this workplace. I don't know what people are going to do, so hopefully it'll be fine, but I can't guarantee anything. That's when people were more likely to act out. So that's when people experienced more harassment and discrimination, when they felt like nobody was going to actually come down on them and sort of rein them in. And this is very typical to what researchers have found in terms of sexual harassment of women, that when women work for places where employers say very clearly, we don't treat women like this, we have very clear rules of respect, that you see less harassment than when you have places where, men are just kind of pigs, and they might harass women and we can't help it. So that kind of top-down support is really key. The outsider within perspective of trans men reveals how gender difference and gender inequality are produced in face-to-face interactions and maintained within workplace structures. This persistence is fueled, I think, by these natural difference schemas that attribute these very divergent abilities and skills to men and women and attribute this to nature. My research shows that potential challenges to these schemas can be absorbed by institutions and social actors in a way that minimizes change. So individuals might see a positive or negative change in their lives, but the structures kind of remain the way that they were before. And this is often a depressing ending, so people often tell me that this is depressing, and it sounds like I'm saying the more things change, the more they stay the same. But I think that it's actually, for me, I like to kind of end on a more positive note. I'd say you can kind of reverse that aphorism that, to go back to Marshall Solins, the more things appear to change, stay the same, the more they actually change, right? That I think there is a lot more going on here, that people might think that they're doing the same thing that they're always doing, when in fact change is happening. So the fact that people can sort of redraw these gender boundaries, they can exclude trans men or they can include them, shows, I think, the power of the individual. Right, it shows that inequality is not something that comes just from tradition or comes from biology, that people do have this major role in shaping these kinds of behaviors. And I would say that a lot of these workplaces that open trans men had successful transitions in might look like they've gone back to the same, but instead, there are these possibilities that I think did not exist previously. So one thing that I did notice was when people had a successful open transition, they often tell their friends, and in some cases workplaces could end up very quickly being known as a place that was really trans-friendly and might get many different trans employees, which often forced coworkers to think a little bit more about, certainly questions of the prevalence of transgender people, but their right to exist, and get more experience working with transgender people. And I think it's those kinds of experiences that do lead eventually to some kind of social change. Thank you.